Welcome back, virtual circuit riders. We want to continue to tell the story of important schisms producing independent Methodist churches in the 19th century, something that curiously enough we're still living with in American Methodism. To tell the story of the most important split, the Methodist Episcopal Church of the North and the South in the 1840s, we have to go back a few decades to tell the story of abolitionism and slavery in North America and the regional fissure or polarization that occurred beginning in the 1820s. We'll also tell the story of the Wesleyan Methodist connection as well. The North and the South as regions were beginning to show bitter political division as the question of new territories coming into the United States, as they petitioned Congress. The concern of abolitionists of the North was that if you admitted states as slave permitting and slave-holding states, you'd weaken the abolition movement. And of course, conversely, Southern politicians, congressmen, senators feared that every new state admitted to the Union would further make the Southern position on slavery the minority. And these were being admitted, in particular Missouri petitioned Congress in 1819 to become a slave state. And so it set in motion bitter arguments leading to the Missouri Compromise, which made any new states above latitude 36 degrees 30 free, and those new states admitted under that line slaves. These regional tensions and arguments continued, only transferred within the Methodist Episcopal Church. The way it was transferred was that northern delegates to General Conference were gaining in strength, really from the time of the 1808 Delegated Conference, the first General Conference. Southern center of gravity in this Southern Methodism began to wane with delegated general conferences, and into the 1830s this strong northern dominance of the General Conference through its delegates created an uneasy tension with Southern delegates trying to maintain the ability to hold slaves as members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. The way the kind of compromise, if you will, of General Conference worked out, the most extreme of the abolitionists of the North, particularly during the 1830s, the General Conference of 1836 and 1840, began to demand that Southern Methodists, in particular pastors, desist from holding slaves. The more mild of the northern delegates tended to vote with the more moderate southern delegates, who, rather than holding on to a pro-slavery stance, simply wanted no new slavery in the new states coming in. So moderates of the North and South got together and tended to vote in ways that would defeat the extreme abolitionists wishing to dismantle slavery in the 36 and 1844 General Conference. This began to anger the abolitionists to no end. They could see that these do-nothing General Conferences really were protecting Southern slave-holding interests. But the moderates of the North feared that if they voted to censure Southern delegates, and in particular members of annual conferences and pastors, that the South would succeed. Rather, in 1840, when this last do-nothing conference, where the moderate delegates of the North sided with the South, the most extreme abolitionists of the North in the Genesee Conference, which is modern-day Buffalo area, these ardent Methodist abolitionists decided that they would never be able to break the power of moderate northern delegates allied with the South to dismantle slavery. And so this man here, Orange Scott, from the Buffalo area, along with Leroy Sutherland, decided in 1842 to take the most ardent abolitionists out of the General Conference and out of the Methodist Episcopal Church, forming a year later the Wesleyan Methodist Convention. Northern delegates saw their position weakening in the upcoming General Conference of 1844. So their position to be able to censure the South became more important and more strident at the time of the 1844 General Conference. This is the backdrop that created the dramatic General Conference held in New York City at Green Street Methodist Episcopal Church in May of 1844, where a number of the northern delegates created test cases in which to test the power of General Conference to bring Southern Methodism into abolition. And the way to do that, it was discovered through a constitutional move to bring censure against this man, Bishop James O. Andrew, who lived in Oxford, Georgia, not too far from Atlanta here. And he had inherited a few slaves, one in particular named Kitty, from in the death of his first wife. He remarried, and his second wife was a slaveholder of this in particular, this domestic servant, Kitty. Technically, James O. Andrew argued he did not own the slaves, they were his wives, but the General Conference believed that with bishops being required as general superintendents to oversee and to itinerate and to serve annual conferences in the North, that James O. Andrew, as a slaveholder or one who held slaves through family relations, would be unacceptable, and so therefore brought charges for him. Ultimately, through political maneuvering, sort of compromise was offered that rather than stripping him of his episcopacy, finally, that they asked him to desist from the exercise of his episcopal duties until the impediment of slaveholding was reserved or removed. This is the 1844 General Conference. The Southerners realized that if James O. Andrew resigned, that this would show the General Conference had the power to both make and break bishops. James O. Andrew was not impeached on moral charges, just that this slave impediment held him so long as he held the slave. So one argument was for him to manumit the slave, but Georgia law prevented manumission of slaves. One other option was to allow the slave Kitty to immigrate to Liberia under the American colonization scheme, yet Kitty refused to do so, saying that Georgia was her home and her life with James O. Andrew was the only life she knew. So in the end, Bishop Andrew was on the horn of a dilemma. The Southern delegates recommended that it was impossible for him to resign, and this set in motion a walkout, in a sense. The 1844 General Conference, a plan of separation by the Southern delegates was put together and formed the year in between May 1844 in New York City and May of 1845. The plan of separation on how to effectively create the Methodist Episcopal Church was planned and executed, ratified here in Louisville, Kentucky at 4th Street Methodist Church in May of 1845. So you see on our PowerPoints here, Bishop James O. Andrew, while some might argue, and some scholars have recently revisited the whole issue. In particular, former Emory University professor of history Mark Auslander has done some work that has actually gone back and overturned some of the myths of the James O. Andrews story. Auslander argues that actually there was a relationship between Bishop Andrew and Kitty that was of a intimate nature, and this is what forbade the manumitting of the slave and sending her away. The northern delegates voted to relieve Bishop Andrew of his authority. The southern bishops saw this as an attack on their own authority and an issue of constitutionality rather than an issue of slavery, regional autonomy, in the face of deciding constitutionally, according to the discipline, what was the limits of the power of General Conference. So it was necessary to create the Methodist Episcopal Church South. The laity of the Southern conferences were none too pleased when they learned of the split. Perhaps the constitutional or the disciplinary issues of episcopal power in the South versus constitutional disciplinary power of the General Conference was a little bit too abstract for them. Nevertheless, the plan of separation was a type of divorce decree that settled on which property and where the kids would live, as it were. Who would take the property of the publishing house in New York and Cincinnati, and where the churches, particularly along the border states, would adhere to the northern or the southern church. The bishops most aligned with high episcopal authority in the face of a constitutionally limited General Conference were, of course, Bishop James O. Andrew for the personal reasons, but Reverend Joshua Soule here, who authored the MEC Constitution of the discipline, was always an ardent supporter of strong episcopal authority, that the General Conference could not break the power of a bishop. And so Joshua Soule, who's originally from Maine, I believe, became the second bishop of the Southern Church. You can see here the map of the conferences on the eve of the Schism that produced the Methodist Episcopal Church South. You can see the southern states here. Here's the Mason-Dixon line, and these underlined places are the names of the conferences. The plan of separation allowed churches in the border states, particularly along the Ohio River, to decide whether they wanted to adhere north and south. And you can see here in these darker bars, these are slave states where some of the churches decided to go with the Northern Church in 1845 at the plan of separation. Also, there were some northern free states where some of the churches along the Ohio River Valley decided to adhere to the Southern Church, and towns such as St. Louis, Cincinnati, the Baltimore Conference here itself, the northern churches and churches in northern Virginia went south. And you can see here that all along the Ohio River, the plan of separation created arrangements where northern and southern churches were often separated only by a few blocks. As in other divorces, the southern churches fought over the and the northern churches fought over the property, in particular of the publishing house in New York and Cincinnati, ultimately going to the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court granting rights and property rights to the Southern Church, who set up their publishing house in Nashville. The split of the Methodist Church into the northern and southern regions was not the only mainline Protestant church that did so. The Presbyterians split in 1837 and the Baptists in 1845. But the sheer size and numbers of Methodists in America signified a polarization that would only increase up until the Civil War began in 1861. Henry Clay, the great politician, observed that the cords of the country were snapped with the split of the Methodist Church. With two Methodist Episcopal churches, the House of Wesley in North America was divided, and this only foreshadowed a house divided in American politics.